fineness of her stitching, the colors that she's chosen to have here. In particular, though, the work that is at our front window is just phenomenal. You feel the space, the time, and you can walk through it and become part of the art. She has color, and she brings you into each piece that you see here. Quite an artist. We're lucky to have her here. It's so soft and light, colorful. You could feel very many emotions when you're looking at her artwork, and I'm very proud of her.
It was very enlightening. I love linear work, and I love the lines in here and the layering and colors. I think it's just absolutely breathtaking. It changes as wherever you stand. If you stand close, it looks one thing, and if you stand far away, it looks like something completely different. And that's what I enjoy about art, is having a change, having your experience be different when you're looking at it, and also just realizing and hearing her talk about women's work and crafts and how she's moved beyond that to create her pieces. So thank you.
So this work, it was all created in 2019. I started this in the fall of 2018. There are several things that this work addresses. The first piece of it is the notion of ephemeralness and the idea that we can't, or I can't really name my own things in my own experience. Sometimes things are indefinable. And so as a student of Zen Buddhism, there's a thread of sort of this idea of form and emptiness that comes throughout my work. The idea of presence and absence, the idea that two things could exist at the same time, and that we don't have to choose sort of that moment of our existence. The other theme in my work is environmentalism, and much of the materials that you see are, how should I put it, they are disposable often in our society, so I reclaim them. Some of the materials are recycled. Most of these materials are extremely inexpensive, and I assemble them to try to restore value in things that have lost value in our throwaway culture. So as I was making this work, my process is I make the work, and it's a very sort of internal process, and then as I make the work, I start to understand what I'm doing. And sometimes I make the work, I look out into the world, and people reflect back what they see, and then I understand slowly what I'm doing. It isn't a process by which I name it in the beginning. So I will start sort of by saying that there was an environmentalist named Rachel Carson who wrote this book in 1962 called Silent Spring. And this book was very powerful to me because she was a woman. She suffered from cancer, but she was determined to get her word out about the impact of pesticides on the environment. And so when I look at this work, I think of her because there is a thread of, in particular, this piece here. This is called Silent Music. And I'll start by talking about this piece, which when I originally started working with the Evanston Art Center on this project, I wanted to design work for the space. I didn't want to impose my work on the space. I wanted the space to inform what I was going to put here. So this piece is basically designed from the context of this window. It's the size and basically the lighting conditions that I understood. Kara sent me pictures last year of the exact lighting conditions at different times of day. It's made of cellophane, and dichroic film. So dichroic film is a type of light reflective film that has the light coming in different colors. And I sewed these different patterns throughout it. At the time, what I felt was that I wanted to sew almost like arteries or bloodlines. And so this work is very much about sort of both bloodlines and waterways. And I call it silent music, in particular because it is an expression for having a knowing of something in your own head that is sort of your own language. And it comes originally from a song that I loved by Bill Evans called Waltz for Debbie, which was written many years ago by a great jazz pianist. But one of the lines is, she dances to silent music. So that to me was very much sort of a full circle of having that interior life and finding the music sort of emerging out of you. The piece behind you here is made of polyester tulle and thread. And these works are very ephemeral. This work, as well as the piece on the long wall, which I'll talk about, these works are in many ways influenced by Chinese landscape painting. My husband studied Sung Dynasty landscape painting, and there is the notion of the idea that there is the mountain, and then the mountain is not there, and that there is this way in which things disappear and appear at the same time. So in some ways, as I make this work, it's as if, again, I'm saying almost that I cannot name it. And so the way that this work is made is that it's hundreds of different pieces of polyester tulle. It's a type of tutu fabric, if you've made like tutu skirts or things like that, and I sew it into different sections and then layer it. And it takes hundreds of hours to make this, and because I work full time, I think like many working artists, I get up super early before work to do my work, but it makes it, it's part of what being an artist's life is a lot of the time. So, so that is sort of the approach on that one. This piece here is kind of a tug of war a little bit, in the sense that I am both very drawn to patterning, but I'm also drawn to sort of this very ephemeral quality. And I think I call this piece Calypso because I'm thinking of the Greek goddess Calypso. I think in some ways that there is a power in both feminine vulnerability, feminine sexuality, and so this piece is really talking about all the ways in which that power is reclaimed. It's, in some ways, it has a phoenix kind of quality to it. And so the sections here have to do with hand-painted vellum. I paint patterns because I'm somewhat obsessed by patterns, which is sort of a microcosm of the work behind you, which is completely unpatterned. But in some ways, because I've studied quilt making, there is this sort of, there's these sort of individual pieces to it. I should start by saying that my training as an artist began in San Francisco. I started out as a painter, as many people often begin as painters. I took a lot of different journeys along the way. I became a sculptor, I did performance art, I did video, I did quilting, and I sort of found my way into this kind of amalgamation of all of those things. I do painting, and that is one way in which I sort of have that. But these works are very much sort of site related, which is what I felt was really important. And then the pieces down the hall here, this piece here is probably one of the most, I would say one of the most, I guess, personal pieces for me. It's called Grandfather Dragon, which is the Cantonese, it's the English translation of Wong, which means thunder, and it's about my husband's life. He is a Chinese American man who grew up in the United States during the era of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so he has lived a very long time, and there's a lot of wisdom in his life. And so this is very much about movement and nature and force. It's also influenced by, of course, my appreciation of Chinese landscape painting, the notion of the unnameable. And similarly, it is many different pieces of fabric that are, again, the tool that I sew together. And then behind you these are thread drawings. And so many of us make marks using pencil or pen. Because I grew up both training as a painter, but also being there with my mother as she sewed, I learned also to draw with a sewing machine. And so that's how these works are sort of situated. I call them the muses because I believe that there's an ancient spirit that goes before gender that is sort of the expression of the female in different forms. And so that's how these come about.
When you talk about these as being female representations, you did tell us a little bit more about how they began and how they became this.
So with this work, it's kind of like like with most of my work, I don't have a particular plan, but I handle the material with my hands, and as I sew, I start to feel these sort of connections or elements. So the sewing machine is very much about me connecting aspects of myself, aspects of the land or my sense or my connection with the world together. I think for me, I'm trying to reclaim the female beyond the definition of culture, because I think that the notion in society of female is way too limited. And so I'm trying to say that there's this power and there's this force, and that as women all we have to do is claim it. Once we claim it, it opens up this creative potential in all of us, and we just have to reach out and hold it. But it takes a long time to have that confidence. So this work is very much about me gaining my voice and gaining that confidence.
Interested in the linear elements of, as you're sewing with the sewing machine, and you mentioned that you're interested in Zen Buddhism. Do you find yourself meditatively sewing, or do you have an idea of when you're going to make the switch and change the linear element from going one way to another?
So it's interesting. I have meditated during different parts of my life. I think like most people, I find true meditation sitting in, on your zafu and seiza or whatever. That is some hard stuff to do. That is like real hard for me. But I find that sewing actually reduces anxiety for me. And this sound that sort of, my husband would call it the endless sound. The endless sound at 3 o'clock in the morning just makes him insane probably, but it actually really calms me. And I find it incredibly calming as I put all these rectangles together. and I assemble and assemble and assemble and assemble. And I think there's a long history of women assembling and putting things together and organizing. And I think if we look at the ways in which women were permitted, so for a long time we weren't able to be in the fine art world, right? So we lived in the world of craft, we lived in the world of the home. And this is sort of me expanding outside the world of the home and saying, this is valid. These centuries of all of us making these things is valid. It's like that. And so this line is very much the line of my life, day after day, getting up and doing this. Yeah. And I think in many ways the line of his life, as I think about him.
How long did this piece take you?
Well, so this piece, I started this piece, I want to say, in May of this year. So this piece took me 3 months, and then the piece on the wall there took me 2 months, and then the piece in the window took me about another 3 months, while I was doing other work along the way. You know, it keeps me busy, and if you get up early enough, you can get it all done.
I imagine you're not working in a studio that has a long wall like this where you can assemble it. So when you're working with it and doing your sewing, how are you thinking about the word you're destroying?
So this was a great test subject. I've never worked on a wall that's 35 feet. I've never had that opportunity. And my studio at home is, it's a bedroom. I don't have my own studio. You know, it's 14 feet. Like, that's it, thank you. You know, right? So I had to make sections. And then when I got here, I realized that I then had to make these sections talk to each other. And so I spent 3 or 4 days with a sewing machine sewing more stuff. Kara was able to dig up a sewing machine for me that, which is another reason why I'm extremely grateful to Kara, who basically found this sewing machine, and then I was able to connect all of these pieces together. Because there's no such thing as the dragon in parts. It needs to be a flowing dragon, not a dragon in chunks.
So the majority, or all but one of these are flat, sort of on a wall as you presented them, but that one is more hanging or mobile-like. Can you talk about that? Do you usually do things that are on the wall? Is that?
Well, so it's interesting because my friend Ron had asked me about sort of my choices, and my understanding is that this center is used, you know, in a lot of different ways. So, you know, education of children, classrooms, people moving throughout the space. One of the things that I did when I started working on this project is I asked Kara, how do people use this space? And I understood that people needed to be walking in there, and then if I hung a bunch of stuff over there, it'd kind of be a drag. So what I did is I knew that they wouldn't be hanging out in the atrium, that little glass area, so I did do a suspended piece there. I do immersive room installations. These are wall-based because I'm trying to be respectful in terms of the flow of traffic. But I basically think about how people live in this space, and then I create work around that. And I think that's one more question. Then I think we have a wonderful Desmond Beach who's coming up, who I'm very excited to hear from. I love your work.
Thank you. I have one.
Yeah.
I've seen several of your shows, as you know, and they're all totally different in the experience. I was wondering how you think in relation to showing and making, in the process of making and then showing. Is showing like a punctuation point for you and then something new begins, or is the process flowing right through the show, like today you're showing and talking about it and so on? When you go back home, are you starting over or are you continuing?
So I think that's a great question. So I think the danger for an artist is to be like, for me, personal opinion, is I showed, this is my stuff, like ta-da, right? If it's ta-da, you're gonna go home and just be like, okay, what do I do now? So I saw this week that I spent here as like active studio time. I was making, like that piece on the wall there, had no plan about that, didn't know that that was showing up, and Kara's like, you know, like, I don't know, like this seemed like another one that, you know, like I just it kind of grew out of that. I wasn't necessarily going to put these 4 here, but I felt when I looked at the space and how I felt about it, it was like active. Like I was like, I'm feeling that, that's what I want to do. So I see it as constant flow. So when I get home, I have new ideas that came from my experience here. Like I want to make an immersive environment with more of the dichroic film that you can actually walk through. And I spent most of this morning writing proposals, probably to places that are totally uninterested.